Welcome back to the Church for Entrepreneurs podcast. This episode of our podcast is a daily study. Daily studies are short Bible studies designed to help grow your faith. As you grow your faith, you're able to successfully achieve the calling that God's placed in your heart. Let's listen to today's daily study. Society has evolved to esteem some physical characteristics and some social standings as more valuable than others. For example, if you're the right color, the right height, the right gender, then you may have an advantage over somebody who's not one of those things. This isn't fair. However, God can use a social privilege for his purposes. So if you have a social privilege, don't just push it away. Seek God because he may be speaking to you to use this particular privilege for his purposes. On today's podcast, we're going to be digging into this concept, and we're going to begin by looking at Moses. Moses was a Jew, and at that time, Jewish people were enslaved by Egypt. And a decree from Pharaoh came to kill all male Jews who were born of a certain age. And Moses' mother didn't want it to happen to him, so she saved him by putting him in a basket, and he floated down the Nile River, and he was found by the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh took the child and adopted him as her son. Look at Exodus 2:10. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. So his name itself, Moses, didn't come from his Jewish parents. It came from his Egyptian mother, who was a daughter of Pharaoh. So by being a adopted son of a princess, he became a prince of Egypt. So Moses had a privilege that the other Jewish people didn't have. He had a privilege of being adopted into the royal family. So while his fellow brethren were slaves, he was a prince of Egypt. So much so that even after he got in trouble in Egypt and had to flee Egypt because he killed an Egyptian, when he was out in the wilderness, when he rescued a lady who became his wife, look how they reference him. Exodus 2:19. An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, they answered, and then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. So Moses was such an Egyptian. He acted such like an Egyptian. He must have had the same speech, the look, the feel of Egyptian, that he was equated as an Egyptian, not as a Jew. So Moses had this privilege of being an Egyptian, even though he was born a Jew. Now, this is a critical point because the cries of the Jewish people that were enslaved in Egypt came to God, and God wanted to set his people free. In order to set his people free, he needed to send a messenger back into Egypt to pull his people out of slavery. Let's look at Exodus 3:10. Now go, for I'm sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. Now he's telling Moses that I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. Now let's stop for a second and think about what really needs to take place here. The Jewish people are enslaved in hard slavery by Pharaoh. And somebody who is a Jew could not walk into the presence of Pharaoh and ask for the release of their people. That wouldn't even be possible. Slaves would not have that right to even be in the presence of Pharaoh. However, Moses has a social privilege of being an Egyptian. Even though he's an adopted Egyptian, he still is an Egyptian. And in fact, more than likely, he is one of the brothers of this current Pharaoh. So not only is he an Egyptian, but he also has a social privilege of being the brother of the Pharaoh. So because of this social privilege, God can send Moses back to Egypt, and where the other Jews could not even enter into Pharaoh's court, Moses can enter into Pharaoh's court because, one, he's an Egyptian and he's the brother of the Egyptian Pharaoh. So God is using Moses' social privilege of being an Egyptian, even though it's by adoption, to get God's purposes on the planet achieve of freeing his people out of slavery. And what I'm showing you in this example of Moses, that there's a certain social privilege that Moses has as an Egyptian. Now, it wasn't fair. Slavery was completely wrong. But in this time, there was a privilege of being an Egyptian. And using this privilege, God was able to set his people free because Moses needed an entrance to even talk to Pharaoh. Let's look at another story of Esther. This is Queen Esther in the Bible. Now, her story is a different type of privilege. She had the privilege of beauty. She was very attractive. And the story of Esther is really a tragic story, but sometimes we romanticize it as she meeting her king. However, when you see this story, she was really kidnapped and forced to have sex with the king and forced to be his queen. It wasn't really her choice. It was because of her physical privilege of looking beautiful that she was able to come into the presence of the king. Let's Let's look at Esther chapter 2, verses 2. So his personal attendant suggested, let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. So the king needed a wife, and so they're going to search beautiful young virgin for the king. And guess what? Esther was beautiful, and she was a young virgin. Now, this is a privilege here, because if you look a certain way in society, if you have certain standards of beauty, you're going to have certain advantages that other people don't have. Even though Esther was taken against her will, let's look at Esther 2, verses 8 through 9. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Hagiel's care. Hagiel was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her, provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maidens specially chosen for the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. So not only did she have a certain privilege because of her beauty, even when she got into the harem, because she looked so good, she found favor with the keeper of the harem that she got extra privileges. Now, because she pleased Pharaoh sexually and was very beautiful, Pharaoh made her queen. Let's look at Esther 2:17. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vaseti. Now she became his new queen, all because she was born beautiful. She did nothing to deserve this, just was a social privilege of a physical attraction that she had that attracted the king to her. Now here's where God can use this particular privilege that Esther had of being very beautiful and having access to the king, because the Jewish people were about to be massacred in an attack by some of the king's men, and Mordecai, which was her relative, wanted Esther to save the people. Now let's look at Esther 4. We'll look at verse 8, then verse 11, and then verse 14. We'll look at this story. Mordecai directed her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. Then Esther replied, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter, and the king has not called me to come to him for 30 days. So Mordecai saying, hey, your people, the Jewish people, are about to be killed. I need you to go to the king and beg for mercy. But Esther is saying, I can't go to the king because if he doesn't call me, he'll kill me. That's the rule. You can't go into his inner court unless you've been summoned. Even though she's the queen, she just can't go see the king. However, Mordecai replies, if you keep quiet at this time, deliverance and relief for the Jews will rise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows? Perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. So Mordecai made a very interesting statement. Maybe God can use your position right now, and you were put in this position because of your beauty for such a time as this. Maybe this social privilege you have of being very beautiful, maybe for such a time as this, you can use this social privilege to free your people. And this is exactly what Esther did. She was so beautiful that when she went to the king, he just looked at her and just bid her to come. He could have killed her, but he didn't, because one, she was the queen and he was physically attracted to her. So her physical beauty allowed her to enter to the king's presence and allowed her to save her people. So God used her social privilege of physical attraction, being married to the king, to allow her to save the Jewish people. Let's look at one last example, and this is the Apostle Paul. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, what social privilege did Paul have? Well, let's look at Acts 16, verses 37 and 39. But Paul replied, they have publicly beaten us without a trial and put us in prison, and we are Roman citizens. So now they want us to leave secretly. Certainly not. Let them come themselves to release us. When the police reported this, the city officials were alarmed to learn that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. So they came to the jailer and apologized to them. Then they besought them. Then they brought them out and begged them to leave the city. So we see Paul is not just a regular Jew. He's actually a Jew who is a Roman citizen. And because he's a Roman citizen, he has certain privileges that other people don't have. In this particular case, he was thrown in prison. And once the prison guard found out he was a Roman citizen, basically everybody came to apologize and let him out of the prison because he was a Roman citizen. Let's look at Acts 22, verses 25 to 29. When they tied Paul down to lash him, Paul said to the officer standing there, is it legal for you to whip a Roman citizen who hasn't even been tried? When the official heard this, he went to the commander and asked, what are you doing? This man is a Roman citizen. So the commander went out and asked Paul, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, certainly I am, Paul replied. I am too, the commander muttered, and it cost me plenty. Paul answered, but I'm a citizen by birth. The soldiers who were about to interrogate Paul quickly withdrew when they heard he was a Roman citizen, and the commander was frightened because he had ordered him bound and and whip. So this social privilege that Paul had, he used it to his advantage in order to get out of situations, in order to preach the gospel in places that other Jews couldn't go. God called Paul to minister to the Gentiles. And one of the reasons God called Paul to minister to Gentiles because he was a Roman citizen, so he could travel in places of the Roman Empire where it would be unsafe for Peter to go. So God is using a social privilege that Paul has in order to get the gospel spread to the rest of the world. And we look at Acts 25:11, we see how far this goes. Paul says, if I've done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I'm innocent, no one has a right to turn me over to these men to kill me. I appeal to Caesar. So the Jewish people had once again beat up Paul, threw him in prison, and Paul is saying to the Roman officials, if I did something wrong, I'll die. But I'm innocent, and you can't turn me over to these Jews. Guess what? I'm a Roman citizen, and because I'm a Roman citizen, I appeal to Caesar, which means because he's a Roman citizen, he has the right to have a hearing by Caesar. This is the leader of the entire Roman Empire that Paul can go see and have an appeal by. And because of his Roman citizenship, they gave him free transportation to Rome. And you know, when he was in Rome, he spent many years there writing and preaching and teaching and evangelizing the Roman Empire. So God is using this social privilege of Paul being a Roman citizen to actually spread the gospel. So the point of today's message is to realize that, yeah, we live in an unfair place. The earth is unfair. People are judged on their race, their gender, skin complexion, social status, education, degrees. There's all type of things that people are judged on. And if you fall on a certain side of that judgment, which means that you're a certain race, a certain gender, the right education, you have a certain social privilege that opens doors for you that doesn't for other people. And if you embrace that social privilege, even though it's not right, God can use that social privilege. You saw he did with Moses. Moses was an adopted Egyptian, so that allowed him to enter into Pharaoh to negotiate the release of the Jewish people. He did with Esther and her physical beauty and that social privilege of looking attractive to save the Jewish people. He did it with Paul because of his Roman citizenship to get him out of tight spots and actually travel to Rome and allow to move freely among the Roman Empire. So it's not right, but God can use it. So if you find yourself in a certain social privilege, allow God to get his purposes apart because of the doors that may be open to you. And when you go through those doors, realize that you may be getting there because of a certain privilege, but God can use this for his good, for his benefit, and for the glory of God, and for other brothers and sisters of Christ and the rest of the world. It's one more tool that God can use to get his purpose across on this planet. I don't want you to disregard that, even though it's not fair. I want you to use it and allow God to use it, just like he did with Moses, Esther, and Paul. That concludes today's daily study, and I pray that it was a blessing to you. Before we wrap up, if the Holy Spirit is speaking to your spirit to partner with Church for Entrepreneurs, go to churchforentrepreneurs.com/partner. Your partnership gives us the time and resources to minister to entrepreneurs around the world. Go to churchforentrepreneurs.com/partner. And if you want to connect with our ministry more, go to churchforentrepreneurs.com and join our online community. You guys be blessed, and I'll talk to you soon.